The jungles of Vietnam have always been a place of profound mysteries, where nature has created some of the most fascinating and dangerous creatures on the planet. Among the dense green of tropical vegetation, where humidity reaches elevated levels and every shadow seems to hide a secret, there exists a world that few truly understand. This is a world where the predators are not only large cats or venomous serpents, but eight-legged creatures that weave their traps with surgical precision, waiting patiently for their prey. For the American soldiers who set foot on that distant soil during one of the most significant wars in modern history, the challenges were not only in combat situations. The challenges were literally everywhere, hanging from branches, hidden in abandoned booths, weaving their webs in the dark corners of bunkers, and waiting in the shadows of improvised latrines. When we think of the Vietnam War, we generally imagine helicopters flying over rice fields, the characteristic sounds of the jungle, or soldiers marching through muddy terrain under torrential rains. But there exists a dimension of this experience that is rarely told with the depth it deserves. It is the silent story, the constant encounter with local fauna that made no distinction between nationalities. These creatures followed only their survival instincts, and the soldiers who entered their territory had experiences that many never imagined having. If you're enjoying this content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with the time you're watching this documentary. Your participation is essential for us to continue bringing fascinating stories like this one. The spiders of Vietnam represent millions of years of evolution in one of the most competitive environments on the planet. The Southeast Asian region, with its humid tropical forests, intense monsoons, and incomparable biodiversity, created the perfect scenario for the development of extremely specialized arachnids. While most people in the West are familiar with relatively harmless spiders, Vietnamese species have developed potent venoms, surprising speeds, and highly efficient hunting strategies. When thousands of young American soldiers, most coming from cities and suburbs where nature had been domesticated for generations, arrived in this environment, they were completely unprepared for what they would encounter. The most feared spider by soldiers was, without a doubt, the giant Southeast Asian tarantula, scientifically known as Haplopelma, a creature that can reach a leg span of over 20 centimeters. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night at an improvised military base, surrounded by the darkness of the Vietnamese jungle, and feeling something heavy walking slowly across your chest. The touch is soft at first, almost delicate, but there is an unmistakable weight, and when you turn on a flashlight with hands trembling with adrenaline, you see those 8 eyes reflecting the light back at you, and those legs covered in thick hair moving with coordination that seems almost intelligent. Many soldiers had exactly this experience, and the psychological impact it causes is something that persists decades later, appearing in recurring memories that remain vivid. These Vietnamese tarantulas are not only large, they are also incredibly aggressive compared to their South American cousins that are better known in the pet market. When threatened, they do not flee. On the contrary, they rise up on their hind legs, exposing their threatening chelicerae, and vibrate their bodies in a way that produces a warning sound. If the threat persists, they attack with surprising speed, driving their fangs, which can be up to a centimeter long, into the victim's skin. The venom is generally not lethal to healthy adult humans, but the pain is described as extremely intense and prolonged. The area around the bite swells considerably, becoming red and hot to the touch, and the discomfort can persist for days, radiating through the affected limb and causing involuntary muscle spasms. Medical records from American military units in Vietnam show hundreds of cases of spider bites, although the actual number is probably much higher, since many soldiers avoided seeking medical treatment for injuries they considered minor, fearing being seen as weak or unfit for combat. A military doctor who served at a base near Da Nang during 1968 recalled in his memoirs that he treated at least 2 or 3 cases of spider bites per week, and that was just in his unit. Multiplying that number by all the bases, outposts, and encampments scattered throughout the country, we begin to get an idea of the scale of this silent problem. But the large tarantulas were not the only arachnid threats lurking in the Vietnamese jungle. There is a family of spiders known as Phenutria, and although Asian species are different from South American ones, they share equally notable characteristics. These are the so-called wandering spiders, which do not build permanent webs but actively roam the forest in search of prey. During the day, They hide under fallen logs, inside rolled leaves, or in any dark cavity they can find. At night, they come out to hunt, moving with impressive speed, capable of covering several meters in a matter of seconds. What made these wandering spiders particularly dangerous for soldiers was their behavior of seeking shelter in dark and confined places. Military boots left outside tents during the night were perfect hiding spots. Open backpacks, helmets turned upside down, even shirt sleeves hanging on improvised hooks. All these places could shelter a wandering spider at dawn. Veterans quickly learned to develop obsessive checking rituals. Each piece of equipment had to be shaken vigorously before being worn. Boots were beaten against hard surfaces repeatedly. Sleeping bags were inspected thoroughly with flashlights before being used. These rituals were not paranoia, they were survival. A veteran named Thomas, who served with the Marine Corps in 1967, told a story that perfectly exemplifies the danger of these wandering spiders. His unit was camped in a temporary clearing after days of exhausting patrols through the jungle. He had just put on his boots, which he had carefully checked as he always did, but had not checked his gloves that were tucked into his belt. When he pulled one of the gloves to put it on, he felt a sudden and intense pain in the palm of his hand. A wandering spider the size of his open hand had hidden there and bit him defensively. The pain was severe and immediate. His hand swelled considerably in less than an hour, and he temporarily lost sensation in his fingers for 3 days. The worst part, according to him, was not even the physical pain, but the psychological impact of knowing that, through a moment of carelessness, he had placed himself in a potentially serious situation. The black widows of Vietnam are another species that deserves special attention. Although smaller than the giant tarantulas, these spiders possess an extremely potent neurotoxic venom. The species Latrodectus hasselti, known as the redback black widow, is found throughout Southeast Asia and was responsible for some of the most serious cases of envenomation among soldiers. Unlike tarantulas, which need to inject a relatively large amount of venom to cause severe symptoms, a black widow can cause serious problems with a tiny amount of its neurological venom. The symptoms of a black widow bite begin almost innocently. There is a small sting, often no more painful than a bee sting. For about 15 to 20 minutes, the victim may even think they were lucky, that the spider did not inject much venom, or that the bite was not that serious. But then the venom begins to take effect. First come muscle cramps, starting near the bite site but quickly spreading throughout the body. The abdominal muscles begin to contract, causing significant discomfort. The heart accelerates, blood pressure increases, and the victim begins to sweat while experiencing waves of nausea. In severe cases, there may be difficulty breathing and spasms throughout the body, as well as intense anxiety caused by the sensation of losing control over physical functions. Military doctors in Vietnam often did not have specific antivenom available, so treatment consisted mainly of managing symptoms, administering muscle relaxants and analgesics, and monitoring while the venom was naturally metabolized by the body over several days. For soldiers who suffered severe black widow bites, the experience was extremely uncomfortable, and the memory of that physical vulnerability left lasting psychological marks. Black widows preferred to build their webs in protected and undisturbed locations, which meant that military latrines were prime spots. Several soldiers reported bites in particularly vulnerable situations, which further increased the psychological impact of these encounters. But perhaps the most psychologically disturbing spiders for American soldiers were the so-called trapdoor spiders. These ingenious creatures build tunnels in the ground, covered by a camouflaged lid made of earth, silk, and plant debris. The lid is designed with silk hinges that allow it to open quickly when the spider detects vibration above it. The spider waits patiently inside its tunnel, sometimes for hours or days, until an insect, a small lizard, or any other suitable prey passes over the door of its trapdoor. Then, in a fraction of a second, the door opens, the spider jumps out with explosive speed, grabs the prey with its powerful chelicerae, and drags it into the tunnel before it can react. American soldiers frequently established defensive positions in forest areas where they had to dig trenches, foxholes, and other improvised fortifications. Often, without knowing it, they were digging directly through colonies of trapdoor spiders. A veteran named Robert described the experience of lying in a shallow trench during prolonged fire exchange, his face pressed against the damp earth, when he felt something moving against his cheek. He turned his head slightly and found himself face to face with a trapdoor spider the size of a golf ball. Its chelicerae opened defensively just centimeters from his eyes. He was trapped between enemy fire above him and this creature below him, unable to move without exposing himself or provoking the spider. He spent several tense minutes in that position, watching the spider watching him, until finally the gunfire diminished enough for him to carefully roll away. The psychology of fear of spiders, clinically known as arachnophobia, takes on completely different dimensions when you are in an environment where potentially dangerous spiders are a constant and real threat. For many soldiers, the stress of being in combat was exponentially amplified by the hypervigilance necessary to avoid encounters with these creatures. Every movement in the periphery of vision became a potential threat. Every unexpected tactile sensation triggered a fight or flight response. Sleep was perpetually light because the subconscious never completely relaxed, always alert to the touch of spider legs on the skin. Military psychologists who worked with Vietnam veterans noted that many developed forms of post-traumatic stress disorder specifically related to spiders. Decades after returning home, these men still could not relax in their own rooms without obsessively checking every corner, still shook their clothes vigorously before dressing, still slept with night lights because complete darkness transported them back to those nights in the jungle. For some, the sight of a common harmless spider in their home in the United States triggered complete flashbacks, sending them back mentally to that place and time where spiders meant pain, danger, and a sense of inescapable vulnerability. The wolf spiders of Vietnam represented another category of threat. These spiders do not build webs to capture prey. Instead, they are active hunters that pursue and ambush their prey with impressive speed and agility. Vietnamese species are particularly large and robust, with some females reaching the size of a human hand when fully extended. What made them particularly notable was their tendency to carry their offspring on their backs. A female wolf spider can carry hundreds of tiny offspring clinging to her abdomen, creating a living, undulating mass that moves as a single entity. Several soldiers reported encounters with female wolf spiders that, when threatened or accidentally disturbed, released their offspring as a defensive strategy. Hundreds of tiny spiders spreading in all directions, climbing legs, arms, and any available surface, created a moment of strong instinctive reaction. Although the offspring were too small to penetrate human skin with their chelicerae, the sensation of being covered by hundreds of spiders was extremely uncomfortable. Men who had maintained composure in difficult situations reacted intensely when this happened, quickly removing their clothes in an attempt to eliminate all the spiders. The giant golden orb weaver, or Nephila, was also common in Vietnam. These spiders build some of the largest webs of any spider in the world, with silk threads that can extend more than a meter between trees. The silk produced by Nephila is incredibly strong, capable of occasionally capturing even small birds. For soldiers moving through the dense jungle, especially at night or dawn when visibility was limited, suddenly finding themselves wrapped in one of these massive webs was quite a disconcerting experience. The silk sticks to skin and equipment with frustrating tenacity, and in the center of that web usually was the female spider, an impressive creature with a body that can be the size of a human hand, marked with vibrant yellow and black patterns. The instinctive reaction to walking through a spider web and feeling the sticky threads on the face is immediate discomfort. Soldiers who went through this experience often reacted quickly, trying to clean the web from their faces and helmets, often only managing to spread the sticky silk even more. And there was always that moment of apprehension when you realized that the spider that built this enormous web was somewhere among the threads, possibly already on you, possibly preparing to bite defensively. Although Nephila bites are generally not dangerous to humans, being comparable to a bee sting in terms of pain, the experience was memorable nonetheless. The sac spiders of Vietnam were particularly problematic due to their behavior of building refuges in clothing and equipment. These medium-sized spiders create small silk sacs where they rest during the day, often choosing fabric folds, pockets, or the inside of helmets as sites for their nests. When a soldier puts on a piece of clothing that contains a resting sac spider, the spider bites defensively. Although the venom is not extremely potent, it can cause local necrosis, where the tissue around the bite dies and forms an open wound that is slow to heal and susceptible to secondary infections. In the humid environment of the Vietnamese jungle, where normal hygiene standards were impossible to maintain, any open wound was susceptible to complications. Sac spider bites that caused local necrosis often required prolonged medical treatment and specialized care. For soldiers who were already dealing with other conditions related to the tropical environment, these additional complications were more than just inconveniences, they could be significantly debilitating. The orb-weaver spider was another common species that, although not particularly dangerous in terms of venom, contributed significantly to the psychological stress of soldiers. These spiders build elaborate circular webs, usually positioned vertically among vegetation. What made them particularly memorable was their impressive size and distinctive body patterns. Many Vietnamese orb-weaver species exhibit vibrant colors and patterns that seem almost artificial in their geometric precision. Seeing one of these creatures for the first time was a surreal experience, as if the spider were a product of graphic design instead of natural evolution. But the beauty of these spiders did not diminish the discomfort they caused. Their webs were often built along trails and natural paths through the forest, exactly the routes that military patrols tended to follow. The soldier at the front of a patrol often had the thankless task of being the first to encounter these webs, becoming covered in sticky silk and occasionally carrying the confused and agitated spider that was dislodged from its central post. This point position was already the most dangerous in terms of enemy ambushes, and adding the burden of being the human windshield for spider webs made it even less desirable. A particularly insidious aspect of Vietnamese spiders was that many species were nocturnal, becoming active exactly when soldiers were trying to rest. The sound that some large spiders make when moving through dry foliage is surprisingly loud, a distinct rustling that can be heard several meters away on a quiet night. For soldiers lying awake in their sleeping bags, hypervigilant for sounds of enemy infiltration, these sounds of spiders moving were indistinguishable from potential human threats. Each rustle required investigation, each sound triggered adrenaline, and the result was that true and restorative sleep was almost impossible to achieve. The jumping spiders of Vietnam were smaller than many other species discussed here, but no less memorable. These spiders possess exceptional vision for arachnids, with large frontal eyes that give them an almost mammalian appearance. They do not build webs to capture prey. Instead, they hunt them visually, stalking them like miniature cats before jumping on them with impressive precision. What made these spiders particularly disconcerting was that they often entered human living areas, attracted by insects that were, in turn, attracted by people. A jumping spider landing on your hand or arm and then turning to look directly at you with those large eyes, clearly aware of your presence in a way that most spiders are not, created a deeply uncomfortable sensation. There was an almost conscious quality to their actions, a deliberation in their movements that suggested more intelligence than we generally attribute to invertebrates. And then, without warning, it could jump, covering a distance that seemed impossible for such a small creature, landing in a new location and turning again to observe you, as if playing some incomprehensible game. Official military records rarely mention spiders specifically, focusing instead on combat statistics, casualties from firearms, accidents, and more conventional tropical diseases. But the letters that soldiers sent home tell a different story. Hundreds of these letters, preserved by families or donated to historical archives, mention spiders. Some soldiers tried to joke about it, laughing nervously through writing about their various experiences. Others were more direct about the fear they felt. A 19-year-old wrote to his mother, "I always thought spiders were just something you sweep out of the house. I never knew I could have true dread of them until I came here." The impact of Vietnamese spiders on troop morale was significant, although difficult to quantify precisely. Commanders noted that units stationed in areas with particularly dense populations of large spiders exhibited higher levels of stress, sleep disturbances, and general tension. Some soldiers became so obsessed with checking their equipment and sleeping area that they developed almost compulsive rituals, spending an hour or more every night on meticulous inspections that objectively exceeded any practical necessity. For these men, control over their immediate environment, ensuring that at least their small personal space was free of spiders, became a way to maintain sanity in a situation where much more was beyond their control. Military medicine eventually developed protocols for dealing with spider bites, recognizing them as a legitimate medical problem requiring attention. Doctors learned to distinguish between bites from different species based on symptom patterns, although this was often a challenge because most soldiers had not clearly seen the spider that bit them, reacting only to sudden pain and then seeking treatment. Treatment was generally symptomatic, focusing on controlling pain, preventing secondary infections, and monitoring for serious systemic symptoms that could indicate more serious envenomation. An interesting aspect of the relationship between soldiers and Vietnamese spiders was that some men developed a kind of fascinated respect for these creatures, recognizing them as supreme survivors in a brutal environment. These soldiers began to study the spiders, learning to identify different species, observing their behaviors and hunting strategies, even occasionally capturing them for closer observation. For these men, the spiders became a form of meditative focus, a distraction from the war that was simultaneously intellectually challenging and completely alien to the human conflict around them. One veteran described it as a way to remember that there was more to the world than just war, that life continued in all its strange and wonderful forms, indifferent to human affairs. But for most soldiers, spiders remained simply another item on a long list of things to fear and avoid. Along with other environmental dangers, spiders were part of the daily survival experience that defined life in the Vietnamese jungle. Each day required constant vigilance, careful attention to details that could make a significant difference in personal safety. The stories of these encounters with spiders became part of the folklore of military units, passed from veterans to new recruits as warnings and, sometimes, as deliberate exaggerations to scare the inexperienced. As in any oral tradition, the stories grew in the retelling, with spiders becoming larger, more aggressive, more venomous with each version. But the fundamental truth remained: the spiders of Vietnam were genuinely formidable, and the soldiers who faced them had every right to respect and fear them. When soldiers finally returned home, they brought with them not only memories of combat, but also these experiences with Vietnamese wilderness. For many, reintegration into civilian life was complicated by the hypervigilance developed in the jungle. Seeing a common spider in an American garage could trigger a completely disproportionate reaction to the actual danger, a response that left family members confused and concerned. Therapists who worked with veterans learned to include these spider-related phobias in their assessments and treatments, recognizing them as legitimate symptoms of trauma. The science of spiders, or arachnology, benefited in some way from the Vietnam War, as military biologists collected specimens and documented species that were little known to Western science. Several new species were formally described based on specimens collected during the conflict. But for the men who actually lived among these creatures, science was irrelevant. What mattered was the visceral experience of coexisting with eight-legged predators that did not recognize human supremacy. As the years passed and the Vietnam War receded into collective memory, becoming history instead of current event, these stories of spiders remained vivid for those who lived them. At veterans' reunions, in therapy sessions, in late conversations when defenses were low and memories flowed freely, men still talked about the spiders. They talked about the weight of a tarantula walking across their stomach while they slept, about the moment of terror when you put your hand in a boot and felt something hairy and alive move, about waking up with a swollen face after a nighttime bite from a spider you never saw. To fully understand the experience of American soldiers in Vietnam, we need to recognize all dimensions of that experience, not just the battles and bombings that dominate history books, but also these smaller and more intimate struggles against an environment that was fundamentally alien and hostile. Vietnamese spiders taught a generation of young Americans lessons about vulnerability, about the limits of human control over nature, about the fact that danger can come from any direction and take any form. Today, the jungles of Vietnam continue to harbor these same species of spiders, living their lives according to patterns established by millions of years of evolution, completely unaware of the human history that unfolded among their trees and along their trails. For them, the American soldiers were simply a few more large animals that passed through their territory for a time before leaving only confused traces and temporary disturbances that the forest quickly reclaimed. But for the men who survived this experience, the memories persist. They carry with them not only physical scars from bites and wounds that never healed completely clean, but also psychological scars that are equally permanent. The sound of something moving in the darkness, the unexpected touch of something on the skin, the sight of 8 legs moving with alien coordination, all these triggers can instantly transport them back through decades to that time and place. The story of Vietnamese spiders and American soldiers is, ultimately, a story about confronting the unknown, about being forced to exist in a world where familiar rules do not apply and where dangers you never imagined become daily realities. It is a story about adaptation, about learning to survive in conditions that test the limits of human endurance. And it is a story about respect, about learning to recognize that humans are not the only formidable predators on the planet, that there are other forms of life that are equally well adapted, equally determined to survive, and in their own domains equally dominant. As we reflect on these stories, we are reminded that nature operates according to its own laws, indifferent to human conflicts and concerns. The spiders of Vietnam were neither allies nor enemies. They were simply creatures doing what evolution programmed them to do: survive and reproduce in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. That humans chose to wage war in that same environment was a decision that brought consequences that went far beyond the obvious battlefields. For every soldier who went through the experience of serving in Vietnam, the specific set of memories and traumas is unique. But for those who had significant encounters with the spiders of that distant land, those memories remain surprisingly vivid and powerful decades later. This tells us something profound about the nature of fear and memory, about how experiences that threaten our fundamental security and challenge our sense of control over our immediate environment leave marks that time does not easily erase. The Vietnam War ended more than 50 years ago now, but its lessons continue to resonate. Among these lessons is the recognition that when humans enter natural environments for which they are not adapted, they become vulnerable in ways they may not have anticipated. The technological marvels of modern warfare, helicopters and automatic rifles and radio communications, offered no protection against a spider entering your boot during the night. The military hierarchy, combat protocols, the entire organizational structure of the army had no relevance when you were alone with an 8-legged creature whose venom could cause prolonged discomfort. At this moment of reflection, it is appropriate to acknowledge that all creatures, from the largest mammals to the smallest spiders, are works of a creation that transcends human understanding. The Lord God, in His infinite wisdom, wove an interconnected web of life where each species has its place and purpose, where even the creatures we fear and avoid fulfill essential functions in the grand tapestry of existence. The Vietnamese spiders, however frightening they were to the young soldiers who encountered them, are testimonies to divine creativity, examples of exquisite design refined through ages of adaptation and survival. May we all learn to see not only the terror, but also the wonder in all the works of creation.